Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming out this evening for a lecture by our international guest speaker, Hammad Nasar, who's the head of research and programs at the Asia Art Archive. Tonight's lecture is presented in partnership with SFU's Office of Community Engagement, and I'd like to thank Abbot Hall and the team here for their support and for partnering with us on this event. I'd also like to thank the Contemporary Art Society of Vancouver because they are also involved in the presentation this evening, and I'd like to thank everyone there for their support. I'd also like to thank our public funders because Centre A is funded by the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Arts Council and the City of Vancouver, and I'd also like to acknowledge the many donors who support Centre A's work. So I met Hammad 10 years ago, something like that, in London. While I was travelling to research for an exhibition that became part of the Commonwealth Games Cultural Festival in Melbourne. That was in 2006, I guess. We were introduced by mutual colleagues, and we shared an interest in a number of the same artists, I think, who were emerging at the time. Our paths have crossed a few times since. And you know, tonight I'm very happy that Hammad has accepted Centre A's invitation to visit Vancouver. On this occasion, to coincide with an exhibition at Centre A called Minutes from a Second Story by a Montreal-based artist, Hajra Waheed. And for those of you who haven't come by the gallery yet, please do come by and take a look at the show. In 2008, I introduced the artist, Hajra Waheed, to Hammad in Toronto, and at the time she had just shown me a very compelling series of drawings called the Anusian Passport series, a series of what ended up being a suite of, I think, 198 drawings, portrait drawings, based on studio portraits by an Armenian photographer who had been working in Turkey. Hajra showed Hammad the series, and the next thing I know, the pieces had been bought by the MoMA. So it was a very exciting sort of sequence of events, and I think Hammad will probably talk about some of that work in his talk today. So now here we are, so many years later, and I've finally had the opportunity to also work on a project with Hajra, including the opportunity to commission some new work. And I'm delighted that Hammad can also be here to participate in the programs related to the show. Hammad Nasar is a curator and writer who recently moved to Hong Kong as the head of research and programs at the Asia Art Archive, where he plays a strategic role in developing the AAA's collection and shaping initiatives, partnerships, and programs that generate new thinking around the material in the collection and about the art of the region. He was previously the co-founder and the curatorial director of the London-based arts organisation Green Cardamom. He was a fellow of the Clore Leadership Programme and a research fellow at Goldsmith College and arts director for the UK Festival of Muslim Cultures between 2006 and 2007. His recent exhibition projects include Safavids Revisited at the British Museum, Where Three Dreams Cross at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, Beyond the Page, Miniature as Attitude in Contemporary Art from Pakistan at the Pacific Asia Museum in Pasadena in California, and Drawn from Life at the Abbot Hall Gallery and Museum in Kendal in the UK. His ongoing curatorial projects include Lines of Control, Partition as Productive Space, and Mashq, Repetition, Meditation, Mediation. Prior to that, prior to entering the art world, Hammad worked as a management consultant and banker, and the title of his lecture this evening is Navigating the Imagined Geographies of Contemporary Art.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Hema and the team at SFU, Andrea and Johal, for inviting me here. This is my first trip to Vancouver, and the one thing that I knew about Vancouver is that it rains all the time. And I'm so glad that at least for these first about 20 hours in Vancouver, that has proved not to be true. If it can continue for another 20 hours, I'm safe. I'm off. It's a real pleasure to be here. And when Hema invited me to talk here, she sort of raised the scepter of, can you sort of address the Middle East or West Asia? And this is a treacherous terrain, these words. And as I sort of got to looking at what's been happening in this part of the world, I could see that a lot has been done and seems to linger in the air. I sort of came across the work of Jay Saloom and his exhibition East of Here in the 90s. More recently, Jamali Hassan's Orientalism and Ephemera. And then just this year, I understand that there's been an exhibition at the Museum of Anthropology, no less, called Suffer or Travel. And Slavs and Tatars did a show just a couple of months back. So there seems to be a lot of material already in the air. And so I'm going to rely on a 10th century polymath when I get into these treacherous terrains to navigate them. This is a man called Al-Biruni, who was born in what would now be Uzbekistan. And among the many things he did was come up with this concept of an egocentric map. Now, what the egocentric map is, it puts you in the middle, and as you move from place to place, the map moves with you in the center. So Google Maps, but thought of as an idea in the 10th century. And the egocentric maps that I wanted to share with you over the next, say, about 45 minutes or 50 minutes, if you let me, will focus on 3 instances of such navigation. 2 from my experiences as a curator and researcher at Green Cardamom in London, and then more recently at the Asia Art Archive. And 1 as an observer of the artistic practice of Hajra Waheed, whose show I would encourage you to take a look at Center A. So let me sort of just take you through these 3 points of navigation one by one, starting with Green Cardamom. Green Cardamom was started in 2004 in London as a reaction to what myself and my co-founder, Anita Daud, who just also happens to be my wife, what we felt was lacking in what passed for international in London. We were interested in trying to inject a view of the world or a view of the international that came from a different ocean, from the Indian Ocean, into an art world which was very Atlantic Ocean centric. Exhibit A here is for $9.99 you can get a replica of that wall at Tate Modern that some of you may be familiar with, which is written in that full handwriting which passes off as something casual, but casually lays off a roadmap for the major movements and important artists of the last 100 years. Of course, these are not the major movements and important artists of the last 100 years. They happen to be the major movements and artists, important artists, in a Euro-American canon for the last 100 years. And into that sort of mix, you suddenly have Takashi Murakami coming fully formed in the 80s, or Anish Kapoor, similarly so in the 70s, and then a few sort of smattering later on. But they seem to be, hovering, floating, unanchored, unencumbered by any histories. And this sort of in our little way, what we were trying to do was to intervene. So Green Cardamom was a strange creature. We were a not-for-profit but we were funded primarily by a gallery program. But we used the gallery as a curatorial lab and sort of tried to develop accumulative platforms through exhibitions, but also symposia, talks, projects. I'll sort of just run you through 3 or 4 of them and then focus on a couple to give you perhaps something to hold on to for a wider discussion around navigation. The first of these was around the idea of innovation through a tradition, as opposed to innovation in rejection of a tradition, which is much more familiar with the Euro-American avant-gardist model. You know, the past, I spit on you, I'm going to go forward. As opposed to the past, I'm going to master you and then move on through. So, I mean, Zen archery comes to mind where the aim is to have no aim, but you need a lifetime of practice to get there. There are various exhibitions. I'll perhaps just touch on the show and the program we did at the British Museum as a contemporary response to the Shah Abbas exhibition. And where it argued that if you were actually looking for the remnants of the Safavid tradition, it was much more likely to be found in Lahore than it was in Tehran because of the revival of the contemporary miniature. Another was the idea of the popular and the everyday. It was not just Warhol, who got popular, who had the everyday, who had the ephemeral. The rest of the world produces ephemera too. How did they react? How did those things circulate and move forward? Another platform was looking at notions of identity, belonging, nation. Many of the themes that we'll be touching on today. And I'll come back to talk about one such project, Lines of Control, in detail. But right now, I just also want to touch upon an exhibition and a symposium. The exhibition was called Who Are You? Where Are You Really From? And this was at the Whitworth Art Gallery of the Manchester University. And it was curated with, I curated the show, but it was accompanying a symposium that I co-curated with Amelia Jones, who is now an honorary Canadian, of course, at McGill at Montreal. And that symposium looked at faith and identity in contemporary visual culture, and particularly the conflation of race and faith that happened post 9/11, 7/7 in the UK. Last of these platforms is a particular, if you like, indulgence of mine, which is an interest in drawing. Also, because drawing seems to be, or to me, and I think to most people, the sort of true universal art form. Every kid who's born knows how to draw until it's drummed out of them. But when you look at histories of drawing in the sort of books that circulate with Phaidon and etc., you get to see a very sort of shortening again, this Atlantic Ocean-centric view of what the histories of drawing are. So we started a project where we did 3 small shows, drawing space, drawing process, drawing form, and then put them together and put them into conversation with a collecting museum, the one in Kendal that Hema mentioned earlier. It was called Abbot Hall, and Kendal, because it was coming from a real pastoral history of drawing in the UK. So this is where Turner went to draw. This is where Kurt Schwitters eventually settled when he left. And this was this sort of small museum with an eclectic but really canonical collection of drawing. And what this project then did was produce a conversation across continents and centuries in an expanded language of drawing. And what we were able to do was really to take over the entire museum. So the ground floor galleries, which is the permanent collection in situ, we intervened. So, at the entrance you had Lucien Freud's etching. So we invited a young artist from Lahore to respond. which he did. So this is an etching on leather by Ali Kazim. Abbot Hall has probably the best collection of George Romney anywhere. The work on the table is by a young Israeli artist, Noah Ledor, who took a sonnet composed by one of Romney's sitter and translated it into Braille. And what you see there is Braille rendered in salt on the dining table. This is one of the sections of that exhibition called The Everyday, and I picked this out partly also because the central piece here is a drawing of a carpet by the Iranian artist Nazgul Ansarinia, whose conversion of one of these drawings into an actual carpet was shown in Vancouver. I think the show closed just a week ago. So this is where that came from. And of course, she's drawing her every day, looking at this idea of why do Persian carpets have to depict the past? What happens when they depict the now? In a section called Body Politics, we put into conversation the work of a young Pakistani artist in Kabul, where we literally drew a body onto the bullet-ridden walls of Kabul, and put that into conversation with people like Paula Rego or Ayaz Chokio, a young Sindhi artist, in conversation with Stanley Spencer or R.B. Kitai. And in this last section, called Tracing Landscape, you have the Sri Lankan artist Muhammad Kadir, whose landscapes and in the size of the international flag. So this is the size of the flag that hangs outside the UN, and what it is the land, the sea, and the sky, rendered as the tricolore, or the typical three bands. So looking at how ownership of land and how that gets conflated into the colonial project. And on the other side, you can just about see an L.S. Lowry piece where he has the sea and the sky. So there were these conversations going on, and that continued with this piece in the diary. And I'll just focus on the main picture here, where moving from sort of left to right, you have Zarina Hashmi, the New York-based Indian origin artist, Nadia Kabilinke, the Tunisian artist, and Bridget Riley, the British artist, all using the notion of line in some way dealing with ideas of conversation, a diaristic practice coming on. So this is one such project that we did, and this was trying to inject that view of the Indian Ocean, but into a wider conversation. The second exhibition that I'll spend a little bit of time on is something that we started back in 2005. And it was coming out of really a personal interest and an observation that the partition of India, so in 1947, displaced about 15 million people, and depending on which estimate you believe, led to the death of between 2 to 3 million people. Similarly, the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, which used to be East Pakistan, displaced another 10 million people. And again, depending on the estimates you believed, caused the death of another 2 to 3 million people. So 25 million people displaced, between 4 to 6 million people dead. If you think about that level of human misery, there's only sort of one other comparison that you can, really think of in the 20th century, and that's the Holocaust of the European Jews. But if you compare the visual legacy that they have left, there is no comparison. The partition seems to have left a very small footprint on the world's visual imagination. Why? And it was really that intriguing question that got me started in looking at it. And I was sort of introduced to this question through the work of a number of Indian artists who were responding to political events in India, the destruction of the Babri mosque in Ayodhya, the pogroms of Gujarat in the early 2000s, and were really sort of using the contemporary moment as a lens through which to look at the history that this contemporary is coming out of. And out of this sort of interest in India's partition grew a wider project, which moved from sort of partition to partitions, with the realization that actually one of the major problems that humanity now faces is figuring out how to live with our partitioned selves. Whether it's, Israel or Palestine, the Koreas, Ireland, Scotland has a referendum next year on independence. So how we deal with this seems to be not just an artistic issue and about visual legacy. To me, anyway, it seemed that artists perhaps have something to contribute to how we even think about this issue. And then we started this particular project. Suffice it to say that I'm sort of personally, I take a view of development of projects which is led by a Gujarati proverb, which I'll give you only in translation, which is that if you're going to eat an elephant, do it in small bites. So the Lines of Control is this particular elephant which we've been taking nibbles at from 2005. So it started with a workshop, developed it with a fellowship at Goldsmith. Then we arranged a whole series of artist talks, film screenings, really just sort of nibbling away to develop a certain depth. Out of this also came encounters with artists. In particular, I'd like to mention Sophie Ernst, a Dutch-German artist who started with a wonderful project. She was teaching between New Delhi and Lahore for a time and started interviewing artists who had left, or artists who were interviewing their parents or grandparents who had left their homes at the time of partition. So she would interview them over several days, then would edit this into a little clip, and then would project that clip onto an architectural model, a temporal model, so the same places would turn up again. And then after sort of doing the first thing in India and Pakistan, got the opportunity to extend this to Israel and Palestine through partnership with the Sharjah Biennale. So as this sort of conglomeration and constellation of artists grew, we sort of finally gave shape to our first series of exhibitions. We did 4 of them in 2009. 3 sort of pretty close to each other, one in Karachi, one in Dubai, and one in London. And again, these were done in small bites. These were done with either sort of not-for-profits or commercial galleries, which had a not-for-profit intent, if not not-for-profit form, depending on where they were. And then we found an art gallery up in Bradford, the Cartwright Hall Gallery, that was big enough and was interested enough to then help us combine all 3 to see what that looked like. Just to give you an example of some of the works, this is the work of Naeem Mohaymin, a Bangladeshi artist who splits his time between Dhaka and New York. And he did a piece on the seminal poet, Qazi Nasrul Islam, the only man to feature on the stamps of all 3 countries. So these are actually, he caused a run on the stamps of Qazi here. This is an installation from the Dubai version. One of the joys of working on this exhibition was the ability to invite artists to reconstruct work which had been destroyed, or which they then also sort of reinvented. So this is Anita Dubé's River Disease, which is a series of enamel eyes that you can actually buy in sort of shops in India. And these are the enamel eyes that you put on the sculptures of deities. And according to Hindu belief, it is once that the eye is in the sculpture that actually becomes consecrated, and sort of God basically stares back. So the idea of darshan. The 5 rivers, of course, are the ones that were divided between India and Pakistan in the Punjab. So Punjab literally means 5 waters, and that's what they were. So water as a sort of the birth of civilization, but also disease and rivers of blood. That's where most of those deaths took place, was on the division of the Punjab. This is a piece by the Lahore-based artist Rashid Rana. What looks like a banal photograph of a crowd waving flags as they see airplanes flying in the air, as you get closer, dissolves into stills from Bollywood films, which until a couple of years ago were technically illegal in Pakistan, although the most popular form of entertainment. So this was literally constructing self-identity through the other. The sort of the little phrases in white is how the real world sort of keeps refreshing this topic of partitions. So you can see progress, and all over, from Serbia to the Cayuga Nation in the U.S. to the Gaza War. It was at this time that Cornell University invited us to bring the exhibition to Cornell. I'm sort of not a huge fan of just shipping stuff around. So we got into a conversation saying, look, if we're going to do this in Cornell, we'd love to invite faculty. So to cut a long story short, we ended up engaging with 7 different faculties, from music, art history, of course, and the art department, who helped us, actually literally construct the show, to my personal favorite, the agricultural school, where people brought natural scientists to discuss notions of how disease spreads, or ownership of cattle, or water rights across. It also then started infesting other projects that I was doing. I co-curated a show for the Whitechapel looking at 150 years of photography in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, where the lead curator, Sunil Gupta, took a political stance of saying no dead bodies in this show. The other political stance was there were no colonial photographers in this show. While sort of applauding both of those stances, that 150 year without looking at the partition, sort of, aching for something that's missing. So we did a symposium addressing the partition within the context of this. And why this was relevant to London and the UK, I'm going to share with you a political poster from the British National Party, the right-wing party. So if you can get beyond this oxymoron, which is a Sikh with a turban but clean-shaven, and look at the sort of the message that's being given, here is, a civilizational. Every Hindu and Sikh should be praising the BNP. Anyway. Gauri Gill is an artist based in New Delhi who perhaps some of you would have been familiar with because she won the Grange Prize from Toronto for photography 2 years ago. Not for this particular project, but this is a project that we, as part of Lines of Control, helped her complete, called What Remains. And it looks at the Sikh and Hindu community of Kabul. Until about 1980, there were 100,000 Sikhs and Hindus living and working in Kabul over generations. They were in the constitution of Afghanistan. But within about 15 years, they've all been displaced to Delhi. But of course, what does that mean? And I don't know if you can read, but the little sort of green line, so this is actually her interviews with people, and these are their found photographs. And it says, even now, when I sleep, I dream of Jalalabad. Well, the show then eventually moved to Cornell. It had about 35 artists. It was the largest contemporary art show they've ever done. And it moved beyond India and Pakistan. So this was the first time the exhibition sort of expanded. What you're looking at is a small sort of child's globe that the Irish artist Tom Malloy has then sanded down and painted white, leaving only the man-made lines. This is called Borderlines. We got a chance to commission new work from people like the Rux Media Collective, who looked at poetry and language and the idea of the stranger. Jolene Rickard, who was on faculty at Cornell and works with the Cayuga Nation, so the people who were denied their land by the Supreme Court, but have taken to marking their territory and in sort of highway lines. Just sharing some installation shots. This is Duncan Campbell, the Irish artist, whose wonderful work, Bernadette, just slices together TV films from the UK, from Ireland, and the US of the political activist Bernadette Levin. And Amar Kanwar, whose wonderful Night of Prophecy, travels through India looking at the only sound in this film, which is about 1 hour and 20 minutes, is protest poetry sung in the vernacular. Frances Alice, Loop, and I'll pause here with Emily Jassir's Sexy Semite. A wonderful bit of humor into a show which was perhaps quite heavy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this work, but if you're not, let me introduce you. It took the form of an action in which she managed to persuade many of her friends to take out personal ads in the Village Voice newspaper in New York. I'll read one of them. Hot 30-year-old Palestinian woman seeks older Jewish male for fun in the sun on the beach of Israel. My Semitic body longs for your touch. The piece, of course, is about the right of return, which as a Palestinian, she does not have. But as somebody married to a Jew, she would immediately get. So, and the piece took the form of some of these adverts in the Village Voice and framed responses in other newspapers who started responding to, what are these ads? What are they on about? So the New York Post, for example, had an interview with somebody from Homeland Security talking about, this is a terrorist, stay away, don't get into this. So that conversation, I think, was sort of wonderfully poignant. Lines of Control sort of then intervened in Canada. So the Art Gallery of Windsor has started a 3-year project looking at borders, and they asked us to do something. And for the first one, which happened this year, we invited Iftikhar and Elizabeth Dadi, and they sort of responded with this neon installation, and these are the national flowers I think you can probably recognize the Irish one. I'm not sure about the Sudanese, but Sudan and South Sudan, of course, are the latest partitioned nations. And about 3 hours ago, Lines of Control's next and latest iteration opened at the Nasar Museum at Duke University and will be on till February. It's a smaller show and focuses more on South Asia, which is their sort of interest out of their history school. And then again, I think sort of just demonstrates this notion of this Indian Ocean-centric view of the international and contemporary art. So having looked at the Indian Ocean, I want to shift now to the Pacific. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Asia Art Archive, but I moved there about a year ago. And for those of you who are not familiar, I'm just going to take 2 minutes to give you a brief introduction. And the archive has been, it was founded in the year 2000 and was really coming as an intervention against the lack of knowledge infrastructure in the region. And what I mean by that is the museums are not sort of building canon-making collections. The academy is sort of undernourished, so it's not one that's producing scholarship and scholars looking in depth at the modern and contemporary art coming out and in Asia. So the archive at its very, in these sort of 12 years, has become probably one of the richest sources of published material on contemporary art in Asia. Now it's about 35 people, but it's a small but complex organization. And as with small and complex things, I sort of take refuge in food metaphors. So I'm going to now introduce you to the 3-layered cake. So at the bottom, so the base of this cake is what you see, the physical library, where we have thousands of printed material. Most of this printed material has been donated to us, and most of it comprises exhibition catalogs. Because when you don't have museums building canon-making collections or the academy producing scholarship, exhibitions become the site of sort of art historical construction. The second layer, sort of on top of this, is actually the digital collection. And what you can get on the website are sort of, archives of artists, scholars, curators, and who have allowed us to scan, digitize their life work, and then make it available for free online. And what it allows us to do, and we hope that it will do more often, is actually change the economics of primary scholarship. So, somebody sitting in Vancouver or LA researching on, say, Geeta Kapoor and Vivan Sundaram in Delhi can actually access their collective writings, photographs of Vivan's work, notes of, all online. So these are manuscripts of Geeta Kapoor's lectures. Also available, and I know many of you have a particular interest in China. And this is a project that we started about 6 years ago, and now have nearly 100 interviews with people who were instrumental in creating or really, building the Chinese contemporary art scene in the late 70s and early 80s, including this particular Vancouver resident. who's a co-founder of Center A and managing editor of Yishu, of course. So this is that second layer, so the digital layer. So it's the physical, then the digital, and on top is, if you like, the cream and the cherry, is research and programs. And the job of research and programs is really to determine or help shape what goes into the bottom two layers, but then also develop ways of sort of lines of flight out of the archive, going out into the world, and inviting folks like you, teachers, students, curators, artists, to use the archive and help reshape it and use it as a resource to do the kind of work that we're collectively doing. Now, how do we navigate Asia Art Archive? These are all three big words. What can I get? Voila. You'll see some sort of familiar themes developing here. So this idea of accumulative platforms that we build knowledge around. And two of these platforms are, let me start with the first one, this notion of a knowledge infrastructure. And how do we break that down, just as an example, are the independent alternative spaces. And let me sort of put forward a hypothesis, which is that the alternative spaces, certainly particularly artist-run spaces, usually die, or they morph into something different. But when they're alive, they do something quite magical in a local scene, something that they catalyze something. How do you capture that? And that's one of the strands that we're developing. Exhibitions is another, and there are several more. The second strand is on media. Performance in particular is something that we privilege, given that it's ephemeral. It's particularly in particular places in Southeast Asia and more generally in Asia, is susceptible to political coercion. We have material which we literally had to sort of smuggle out of places, and also performance until, say, a couple of years ago has been largely ignored by museums. And has been sort of underserved by the academy. So for us, we then end up privileging it, because in a way that's also our ideology, is to make things that are less visible more visible. And last, but certainly not the least, is then this notion of geography. And we put it last not because we're trying to diminish it, but we do recognize the problems one has when you start bucketing things. Into region, into country, and these particular countries really are a reflection right now of just where we are and what we've accumulated. This is not by any means a definitive one, and we hope that this will keep changing. And then just to sort of give you a little flavor, there are multiple things we're doing, from archival initiatives to films, to programs, to artist residencies. And you're not meant to read this, so it'll just be voila. But just a little flavor of where our concentration comes in. And this will change over time. But let me sort of give you two little sort of snippets of how we've looked at a couple of things. Firstly, I mean, you've already seen the interviews we did in China. One of the things that was not obvious is that in our approach to China, we weren't centered in Beijing or Shanghai, but we focused on Canton or Guangdong province. Partly, again, because, that's where Hong Kong is also contiguous to. It's our home, that's where we are. But also because these are the narratives that don't get reflected with the old boys network in Beijing. And these are the ones that we want to put in circulation and get them to rub against what else is going on to see what happens. Similarly, in India, just last week, we were at the Clark Institute doing a colloquium with about a dozen of the top scholars of South Asia, the developing field of South Asian art history, where we bounced off them our ongoing project, which is looking at art writing in India in 11 languages across 100 years. So we're developing an online bibliography, and these 11 languages are, Malayalam, Gujarati, Tamil, Urdu, Hindi, Marathi, as well as that primary Indian language of English. And what tends to happen is that only certain texts circulate that come out of Delhi or Bombay in cosmopolitan languages. But what happens when you bump them up against texts, that may have been written in a poetry, magazine in Malayalam, or in a Marxist manifesto in Bengali, and what work do they do? And at least half that crowd of eminent art historians had their mouths open, because what questions it raises is how do you research this? How do you equip yourself to be able to even process this? And we'll keep you posted. This is again another elephant, which not only are we taking in small bites, but we're inviting lots of people to come and nibble at this elephant together with us. Exhibitions, I will just give you one example. We have a symposium next month, which we're thrilled that we will have Yishu as our publishing partner on, where we will sort of make some of that material available as a special issue. But what work do exhibitions do? Well, let me give you an example. This is an exhibition that took place last year at the Tate in London. Migrations, Journeys into British Art. I'll just show you one room of that exhibition. You don't have to take in all the names, but for those who are familiar with the work, Avinash Chandra, Shamsa, Souza, Aubrey Williams, Rashid Arain, Moore Arain, Frank Bowling, David Madala from the Philippines. Well, in that central place, this is a different picture, just showing you what that work looks like when it's functioning. And right at the end, Li Yuanxia, his monochrome white paintings. Now, what's interesting about this particular room is that virtually all the works in this room were part of another exhibition held 23 years ago on the other side of the River Thames at the Hayward Gallery. So it took about 23 years for these works to cross the Thames and into British art. So what do these works do? And what do they do to other art histories? If they have crossed into British art history, what does this mean for Philippines art history, or Indian art history, or Pakistan art history? Those are some of the questions that we are, and in fact, the field of art history is struggling with. We let them struggle away and go to our final point of navigation, the work of Hajra Waheed. Now, Hajra is interested in history. And it's appropriate, I think, for Hajra that we I'm using a reference here from a fictional historian. Somebody that Julian Barnes dreams up in his last novel, Sense of an Ending, a novella really. And this idea that history is produced at that point where the failures of memory are sort of combining with the failures of documentation. And in a way, for Hajra, remembering is a creative act. In fact, remembering is an act of fiction. The first work that I came across of Hajra, which Hema mentioned that she curated, was in 2008, and this was sort of the alternative to the Toronto Art Fair. The work sort of used a family photograph, Nanima, which literally means maternal grandmother. Her maternal grandmother happened to have just killed a big cat. So there's this very unusual photograph of this lady in a sari holding her gun. And then sort of, over a coffee, found out that Hajra has been planning a series of works on the women in her family. The next picture is another one such woman, her grand aunt. And the man whose hand she's holding is, of course, Nehru. So this is the time of just planning lines of control. So just looking at that image, I invited her to take part in it, and that's where it ended up. It also invited her to take part in Drawn from Life, that large exhibition that you saw earlier at Kendal. And this was her participation to that. This is called an Ode to Dead Soldiers. The material is notepaper that she came across in Fez. But it wasn't old enough, so she aged it in the sun and then worked on it with patterns. And if you can just about make out those, what looks like vases, are really bits of airplanes that have been printed onto mylar and just sort of taped onto paper. The passport photos that Hema mentioned earlier, I mean, this is actually quite a remarkable body of drawings. And these are drawings. This is pencil and charcoal, basically hitting the ridges of this paper so that Hajra becomes a virtual human copying machine. And she did 198 of them in sets of 9. And so these are, as you can see, men with glasses, men with patterned shirts, women with long hair, women with necklaces. So she's playing both with notions of photography and looking at what does drawing do to the photograph. At some point, a picture no longer remained worth 1,000 words. With our sort of media-saturated world, it probably became worth about 20 words, or maybe 10 now on Facebook. I think with this particular project, I think Hajra is trying to invest those remaining 990 words back into that picture. The next project that we showed, and what you're seeing here, are floor plans of some of the oldest mosques in the world. In fact, 16 of the oldest mosques in the world. And what you see at the bottom, again, those bits of plane, are actually bits of the U-2 spy plane that in the 60s used to fly from a secret airbase in northern Pakistan. These are called architectural studies. And this is how they were shown in London. And sorry, this is a really dark image, but this is at the Tapis Foundation in Barcelona, where incongruously they're shown next to a Paul McCarthy work, which in the dark looks like a cube, sort of almost reminiscent of the suggestive of the Kaaba, but it actually has a lot of ketchup bottles around it. So what you're getting is this very spare, precise way of working, a very minimalist aesthetic, and a code, a sort of a coded language, almost like a cipher. You need clues to decipher it. Where do you get these clues? This is another sort of new work that she did for Lines of Control. These, of course, are transfer drawings of drones. So you can get these clues in her biography. She was born in Calgary to Indian Muslim parents, brought up in Dhahran, which is a gated compound of Saudi Aramco. How many of you have heard of Saudi Aramco? Hands up. Okay, for those who haven't, it is the world's largest private asset anywhere. It's co-owned by the Saudi government and what used to be called the Seven Sisters, the 7 largest oil companies of the US. It's protected by 2 US air bases, 1 covert and 1 visible. And Hajra grew up next to one of these air bases during the Gulf War. But once you start tapping that biography, you start predetermining those readings of that work. And then the question that comes into mind is that we can all make our own geographies, as Kai Friese has said, but not on maps of our own choosing. So whose maps are we using? This is a map, and I'm grateful to Brinda Kumar, who's a PhD student at Cornell, for uncovering in the archives of the MFA in Boston. And this is a map that has been put together by Okokura Kokuzo, a Japanese art writer and critic, who set up the Oriental department of the MFA. This was done in, I think, 1905, so about nearly a quarter of a century before Alfred Barr did his mapping of modernism. And one of the interesting strands, well, there are many interesting things there is a dissertation in here, probably several dissertations, but one of the interesting strands that you see is from Arabia, which just goes straight down into something called Mohammedan art, and has some relation to things coming from India, from China, from Persia. And of course, these are not just historic documents, because, the contemporary is not free-floating. It is anchored. So this is an exhibition at the MFA today. She Who Tells a Story, Women Photographers from Iran and the Arab World. But why pick on the MFA Boston? This is the Guggenheim's mapping of the world, where they use the Middle East and North Africa, and that strange beast called South and Southeast Asia. Or the Academy. This is Goldsmith's MA in Global Arts. Or this is MoMA's new website, devoted to the modern and contemporary art from around the world. The same MoMA that has acquired 2 sets of Hajra's passport photos. You saw women with long hair, you saw men with glasses, you saw men with patterned shirts. But guess what MoMA got? Men in uniforms. Women in Wales. I actually had the direct sort of conversation with the curator, who I will not name, saying, "Are you serious? The 2 things that MoMA will get out of these 22 sets is women in Wales and men in uniforms?" But to their credit, they sort of thought about it long and hard, and sort of went ahead with their choice. But again, it's a question of how does that get received and how does that get circulated? And then we go back to the sort of questions that we started with. What is the Middle East and what is West Asia? Well, actually, if you go back to looking at these words, language is not innocent. The Far East and the Near East were sort of right and left of India. And these were terms concocted in the late 19th century by the Imperial India Office, really to look at who they were competing with for these blocks of territory. This is the great game. The term Middle East was carved out of the Near East by a US naval historian. And again, in around 1905, the same time as Okakura was making that map. Far East has sort of dropped out of usage. I mean, I hardly ever come across it. But the Middle East continues. Why? And what does contemporary art and the circuits of contemporary art have to do with this? Do artists need a space from which to speak? Do they need a time? Are they required to occupy a position? Can all of these things change? I'd like to argue that Hajra's work is a quietly composed and ever-expanding thesis on the artist's ability, or indeed their right, their need, to reach for a heterogeneity of place, time, and position. I look forward to discussing that with you. Thank you.
This is just a question about the Asia Art Archive. How are you funded?
We are not-profit and non-governmental. So the government gives us about less than 10% of our annual money. About 60% of it comes from an annual benefit, an auction. And then there's a variety of programs for a collector's circle, project funding coming from specific arts programs, corporate funding from local as well as international corporations.
Talked at one point about bringing pieces from different contexts or different times and watching what happens when they rub up against each other. Yeah, so what happens?
It's a case in point. I mean, one of the things, for example, that we're developing ideas around is contemporary miniature, so the Indo-Persian miniature painting tradition, and its contemporary flavor really coming out of Lahore. Calligraphy and calligraphic abstraction coming out particularly from North Africa, South Asia, West Asia, sort of Iran, and then Chinese ink painting and its contemporary terms. So we're sort of putting together a little workshop looking at these three strands and some of the languages. I mean, coming to Hong Kong a year ago, I was really struck by how the paucity of language to discuss what's going on in ink painting. So it sort of very quickly moved into essentialism and Chineseness and connoisseurship. And it was interesting to see that there was work going on in the miniature, and there's sort of research going on calligraphy, but they weren't sort of really talking to each other. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do, or at least try to catalyze, it's not something that we can do ourselves alone, is for these different points of reference, so that we don't have to rely on essentialism. We have other models that we can refer to. What this will lead to, we'll watch this space. But hopefully it'll be sort of, a few steps forward. Yeah.
I'd like to ask if you have any ideas about ways to lighten the burden on the artist. My students and I were just reading a hilarious essay by Sam Bardawil, where he makes fun of several curatorial strategies, including the one of kind of tying yourself up in knots to avoid being Orientalist. And he makes a lot of fun of Hans Ulrich Obrist for saying that he's going to come up with a new term for the Middle East, and then finally at Art Basel, and then finally saying, well, we must wait for the artists to do it. So I think there's a curatorial and scholarly tendency to not want to take any position because that might be politically compromised in some way, and so instead we put all the responsibility on the artist. Can you, and you've suggested some alternatives, but could you talk about that problem a little bit more and ways to avoid it?
Sure. I mean, I think it has to do a little bit with courage. I don't think we should expect courage to only come from artists. I think as writers, as teachers, as curators, as academics, we need to sort of take positions as well. So, I mean, the Middle East is a problematic term, and I try very hard not to use it, or if I use it, to use it in quotation marks. And I think, even language, as I've said before, is not innocent. And I think if we can start addressing language, that'll be a huge change. But it's not going to come, it's not, one person is not going to do this. Even if it's, Hans Ulrich Obrist at Art Basel. It's unlikely that, one person can do it. It's actually about, it's about sharing, and it's about, collective, collaborative action. But I do share your concern about the burden of the artist. But I don't, artists are some of the smartest people I know. So, I think they know how to sort of navigate this conundrum as well. It's just that sometimes it becomes quite frustrating when they have to be the Sisyphus in the room.
Why wasn't your exhibition shown in other cities? Why was it just these 4 or 5 target cities?
Wow. One is, it depends on where some of these artists were coming from and what was meaningful in a particular way. I mean, one of the things I talked about is I'm not a huge fan of the exhibition as commodity, which is just shipped from place to place. So for me, if it's going to be in a particular place, that also requires an investment, ideally from that place. So when it was Cornell, I've sort of asked Iftikhar Dadi, who's on the faculty there, to co-curate that exhibition. Similarly, we had people involved from different places. So it's actually quite a big burden to do something like this. Having said that, it's still a big elephant. There's still lots of room there. I mean, in the last year, I've sort of talked to people in Taiwan, talked to people in Singapore. There are these issues, there are live issues at different places. And I feel no particular need to claim ownership of this notion. So if there are people who are interested in this and then develop a project that speaks to it, bravo. So, the Art Gallery of Windsor, for example, they're doing their own project. And what we did was sort of like a little intervention in it, and I think that's fine. It's as long as it contributes to the conversation, I think that's all that's needed. It doesn't need to have a logo there. Yeah. I think we're exhausted. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming and listening to me on my soapbox. And perhaps I'll sort of meet some of you a little bit later. Thank you. Yeah.